1903, they've gathered to race across France in quest of glory. When the French needed heroes, they looked to bike racing, and that tradition has been passed on from generation to generation. Lifetime could be measured by the legends who dominated the sport and captured the imagination of an entire country. Immortals like Louison Bobet, who was the first man to win 3 tours in a row. Jacques Anquetil, the hero of the 50s, who was the first 5-time winner. The cannibal, Eddie Merckx, who rewrote the record books and dominated in the late 60s and into the 70s. While Bernard Hinault carried the tradition through the 70s and into the 80s. But this race is as much about surviving as it is about winning. Is the Tour de France, as it was and as it always will be. Historically, the Tour de France chooses its champions where the mountains bear the snow of winter. And it was on a mountaintop a year ago that Frenchman Jean-Francois Bernard emerged as a future star. Now, all of France is looking to him to be the man who will continue the legacy of its country's heroes. A man who was expecting stardom but failed was American Andy Hampsten. However, last month he became the first American to ever win the Tour of Italy. And now he's back to prove himself in France. Holland comes the powerful Panasonic cycling team, led by Eric Breitink, who seems destined for greatness. Ireland's Sean Kelly is the #1 ranked cyclist in the world, but his greatest prize, the Tour de France, has eluded him. They will be among the 198 cyclists who are riding all this month in the greatest race in the world. This year, like every year, all of France will gather for the most famous bicycle race in the world, the Tour de France. And hello again, everybody. I'm Tim Brandt. The most famous man in all of France throughout the month of July is the man who wears this, the yellow jersey. So how do you win this? Well, it's passed on each day. It's the man with the best overall elapsed time. One day he may have to race 100 miles across the mountains. The next, 150 miles throughout the flatlands of France. Or maybe an individual time trial where it's just one man against the clock. But again, that's what this race is all about. Trying to beat the clock for 21 grueling days. But the one that'll be remembered is the man that wears this, the yellow jersey in Paris, July 24th, as the champion, the winner of the 1988 Tour de France. This year, they awarded the yellow jersey before the race officially began. Guido Bontempi won an event called the Preface last Sunday, and although his time won't count, the jersey was his, and he savored the moment. Sunday was not a good day for the American-based 7-Eleven team. Bob Roll was injured in a pre-race accident while warming up for the Preface. He suffered a mild concussion and was advised not to continue. An inexperienced New Zealander named Nathan Dahlberg was surprised when asked to fill in.
I was cooking dinner, actually. I just come back from a race, so I was cooking dinner, and someone rolled up about 9 o'clock at night and told me, you know, you're riding the Tour, and I says, no way, it's not possible. But next minute I was in the car coming to France, so it was all on. Arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning, sort of had about an hour's sleep, got some breakfast, and started riding again.
The 2,000-mile journey began Monday in the small town of Ponchatoula. 22 teams of 9 riders each started this race on a cool, cloudy 4th of July morning. Ponchatoula is in the west of France on the coast of Brittany. The race winds through small historic towns in the Loire region before heading clockwise around France. It was the rainiest beginning the Tour had seen in 8 years. Was not the only problem the riders had to contend with. The early race procession was stopped shortly after it started at the Loire River. It was a demonstration by Communist Workers' Union, using this opportunity for attention to protest the layoff of shipbuilders. Eventually, the race regrouped, and out of the pack came Canadian Steve Bauer, a former teammate of Bernard Hinault and Greg LeMond on the great La Viclaire team. Broke away cleanly 4 miles from the finish, and he became the first Canadian to ever win a stage at the Tour de France, and it put him in the yellow jersey. Later that afternoon, the team time trial was held. System U was the best overall team last year, but on this day, it was to be a slow start. Their poor performance didn't help their star, Charlie Motet, who in this event was to share the time of his teammates. Part of the reason for this problem? A struggling old star, Laurent Fignon. The team time trial was crucial for the 7-Eleven team. A poor performance would seriously handicap Andy Hampsten. Partly because of the absence of Bob Roll, the American-based team was a bit shaky. Newcomer Nathan Dahlberg showed his lack of rest and was out of sync with his teammates. Meanwhile, Panasonic rolled on like a well-oiled machine to take the victory. And the man who benefited the most, their favorite and team leader, Eric Broyking, the rising young Dutchman who was destined for greatness. Back on the road, it was trouble for 7-Eleven. Otto Lauritsen Spill pulled back his teammates. More trouble as newcomer Nathan Dahlberg was falling so far behind, he was in jeopardy of being eliminated. His teammate, Davis Finney, had to be sent back to help, further disrupting a time trial in which each man, including Andy Hampsten, had lost over 1.5 minutes to the leaders. Panasonic had made it clear they were the team to beat. Toon Van Vliet had the yellow jersey, but all eyes were on Eric Broyking. For 7-Eleven, no smiles to be found anywhere. And it was only the first day, with just under 2,000 miles and 20 more days to go.
What's that? He's got our flashlights. Over there. Good monkey.
But I said Bud Light.
If you want the one light that outshines them all, ask for Bud Light. Because everything else is just a light.
So hard to get good help.
Do it yourself.
Do it for yourself. Do yourself proud with Minwax and Wood.
Wood finish for beautiful color like no other, and Minwax polyurethane for fast-drying protection that lasts.
Do yourself proud with Minwax and Wood.
Now, a revolution in blade shaving from Remington, the new Remington Electro Blade, with vibrating blades for a close, smooth, comfortable shave. Safe, immersible, and cordless. The new Remington Electro Blade vibrating blade system.
In North Carolina, Honda lawnmowers are assembled from the wheels up. Then the final critical step, the Clara Johnson test. If Clara pulls and it starts, it's a Honda.
Ship it.
The Acura Legend sedan offers such amenities as leather-trimmed interior, sophisticated stereo system, and ergonomically designed controls. Is it any wonder people enjoy sitting in it? And with its 24-valve 2.7-liter V6, is it any wonder they enjoy standing on it? The Legend sedan, precision-crafted performance from Acura.
Do you know why Spuds McKenzie has so much fun at parties? Because he's always in control. Spuds knows it's cool to live by one simple rule. Know when to say when.
A reminder from Anheuser-Busch.
The Fast Track, France's round-the-clock test of the world's best, where glamour and danger meet at Le Mans. A new 48 Hours Thursday.
Days 2, 3, and 4 were pretty much like the first. And in the wettest opening for years, the riders have fought the common enemy. Over 450 miles covered on roads with few natural challenges, 3 riders have gone out with injury caused by the rain. These are the days the leaders of the Tour de France fear most. The days over which they have no control as the roads decide who stays up and who falls down. The Tour de France goes on whatever the weather. There's always some who enjoy the wet, and there's always those who don't. On this day, they skimmed over the road surfaces with the 3rd fastest average speed ever recorded in 75 tours. In such conditions, the inevitable always happens. And even when the sun returned, it made the habit of the first few days difficult to break. Athletes, the body of the professional cyclist seems to be the most resilient. Thoughts of giving up are never entertained. This is why the Tour de France is so very, very special. Henny Kuiper, his 12th and final tour, he's felt it all before. But for others, it's a new experience soon to be forgotten. And first-timer Pascal Richard leaves the race with memories he never wanted. What other profession in the world demands so much from its employees that they entertain no thought of resignation? So these opening days of the 2,000 miles Tour de France have been more a wall of attrition, the leaders dodging the fallers, and the fallers getting back up to fight another day. The race route has twisted gently through Brittany and Normandy, heading up to its first serious battleground on the fringe of the Belgian borders, among the steelworks and coal mines of Roubaix, where the rain had stopped, but the skies were still grey. The crowds on the roadside of this year's Tour de France are as big, if not bigger, than ever before. And I think it's because they suspect a transition in the race, and they too are wondering just who will win. Bernard Hinault, Stephen Roche, Greg LeMond are not here. Others now are trying to write their name in the colourful history of this great race. But until now in this opening week, the big teams have been putting their men up front purely for the publicity. We haven't seen the real men with the ambition to win the Tour yet show their true strength. But today, they can't hide any longer. This is the first of 3 time trials, what we call the race of truth. If they have real ambition to win this Tour de France, then today they must come out to play. Laurent Fignon has won the Tour twice, but injuries have left a question mark on his ability and put a lot on his mind. The new French star is Jean-Francois Bernard. He finished 3rd last year and won 2 of these time trials as well. He now faces the real pressures of stardom. And Sean Kelly, the #1 since rankings began in 1983. This is the Irishman's 10th Tour de France, and at 32, many say the last one he can really think of winning. And there's America's hope, Andy Hampsten, winner of the Tour of Italy. He's aiming for the first American double in the world's top 2 cycle races. Today's a crucial test for him. And if Hampsten falters, then he may find his Mexican teammate Raul Alcala, the new challenger for leadership of the 7-Eleven team and for the Tour victory. For Fignon, it's been a disastrous Tour so far. Just how good is he? In his own System U team, Fignon is rivaled by Charlie Motte, who's waking up to the fact that soon he could be the leader. Fignon used to dominate these time trials. Now he faces the start with thoughts of only surviving, with a result that will keep him in the race among the leaders. Cajoled by Cyril Guimard, the man who trained Fignon to victory in 1983 and 1984, Fignon races into obscurity. His time checks along the route cannot tell lies. They're bad. This year, Andy Hampsten has bowed to no one, but you are only as good as your last performance. And teammate Raul Alcala, also hungry for success, is a rival today. So, Hampsten has a lot on his mind as he takes his turn in the start house. Facing 32 miles, each of the riders depart at 2-minute intervals to make sure this effort is strictly their own. Hampsten's not a pure time trialist, a gifted greyhound like some, but to win the Tour de France you must perform above expectations in every department. Spain's Pedro Delgado, like Hampsten, is also a gifted climber. He too is aiming for a top performance here to take to the Alpine passes next week. Time trialing is a simple concept. You hit the pain threshold and you stay there as long as possible. Hampsten races knowing that behind Delgado has started well, climber against climber on the flat roads of France. Hampsten is now a star in Europe after his Tour of Italy win. He's proved his ability once, now he must do it again, not knowing how fast he must go to beat the rivals who mainly all start behind him. His main concern here is Jean-Francois Bernard. This is his speciality. Hampsten will think only of limiting his losses to the French flyer. At the other end of the course, Laurent Fignon finishes, his time too slow to indicate any revival of a fading star. Even though he has a 1 at the end of his number, indicating a team leader, for him the Tour is already over. Hampsten too has found it hard finishing with a time slower than all of the favourites. Over a minute today faster than Hampsten, Delgado, who's tired but happy. A possible warning too from Raul Alcala, just who will lead the 7-Eleven team in the mountains now, as Alcala, ahead of Hampsten at all the checks, will finish over 50 seconds better. Overall, Hampsten lost even more time to some of the other favourites.
So 2.5 minutes is, you know, it does make a difference, but the race has hardly even started.
Well, it may not have started for some, but for Steve Bauer, it certainly has. A former teammate of Hampsten's, Bauer is a Tour outsider, and on this day, he also beat Hampsten. And for the time being at least, it's Bauer who is challenging for the Tour lead. We'll be back.
It's
Time now to announce this week's Haviland Superior Grade Cool Under Fire winner.
He's Stefan Edberg, the 1988 Wimbledon Gentlemen's Singles Champion. Down a set to two-time Wimbledon winner Boris Becker, Edberg refused to fold. He played up to, if not beyond his potential. He rallied to win the next 3 sets and the title.
There is a lot of fighting spirit inside of me. Maybe you can't tell, but it's in there.
Stefan Edberg, a fighter, a most deserving winner.
This Cool Under Fire award was brought to you by Haviland, the motor oil that's cool under fire.
When you ride the red line, you need superior protection. Introducing new world-class Haviland Superior Grade. When you rev high and run hot, or when you crawl inch by inch, you need performance-proven Haviland Superior Grade. It keeps your engine cleaner and delivers superior heat stress protection. New Haviland Superior Grade, cool under fire.
Friday in the individual time trials, one of the most impressive and perhaps surprising efforts was turned in by the 29-year-old Canadian, Steve Bauer. The former teammate of Greg LeMond, Bernard Hinault, and Andy Hampsten is racing this year for a Swiss team. And as the favorites in this year's tour began sorting themselves out, Bauer found himself missing the yellow jersey by just 1 second. Sean Kelly didn't ride as well as expected. The Irishman, who is usually a star time trialist, will need to open up a lead as he heads into the Alps on Wednesday. Jean-Francois Bernard did well, finishing 9th out of the 198 riders, but he didn't appear happy with his effort, disappearing quickly into his team's van. And the yellow jersey, awarded to the overall leader, went to Jelle Neidam, a Dutchman, whose father, Henk, is a former stage winner in the Tour de France. And here's the way they stood after stage 6, as the favorites began to drift to the top. Andy Hampsten in 58th place was losing time and was very concerned, yet he was still looking ahead.
I'd rather not lose time now. But no matter what, I have to be incredibly strong in the mountains. And whether I'm with everyone or a little bit behind them, either way, I have to do some pretty incredible rides in the mountains. So, I don't know, I'm just trying to do all I can now.
The mountains are majestic, yet murderous. There are some very difficult climbs. But because there aren't as many as tours past, Bauer likes his chances.
There's not as many hard days in the mountains as the last 2 years in the Tour. And in Tour Switzerland, I went over the mountains quite well, except, you know, the Tour Switzerland, they weren't racing as fast as they will be here. But I think I can, I hope to hold my own, you know, in the mountains, at least limit my losses.
Day 7 took the riders out of Rennes and through the Champagne country of France. This tranquil terrain is the home of Dom Perignon, one of the best champagnes in the world. But the best cyclists in the world didn't have time to toast their efforts. The rain of early week gave way to sunny skies and temperatures in the 80s. For the first time, dehydration was a concern. The water carriers dropped back to pick up bottles. Christophe Leven of System U worked for team leaders Charlie Motet and Laurent Fignon. It was a day of high speeds and more crashes. The victims was Laurent Fignon, who made his frustrations of this Tour de France perfectly clear. 23-year-old American Roy Nickman continued to struggle as he has all week, losing 33 minutes in the last 6 days. Tour day, a gentle procession through the undulating French countryside in the morning, and then an all-out race to the finish in the afternoon. An explosion by Olympic silver medalist Steve Bauer, 6 miles from the finish, ignited 13 other riders in the breakaway. Speeds today reached in excess of 50 miles per hour. The final sprint was led by one of Steve Bauer's teammates. Yet the winner was West German Rolf Goltz. Though he didn't win this stage, Steve Bauer's overall elapsed time won him the yellow jersey for the second time in a week. The Ontario, Canada native, known at home as the Fenwick Flash, is now the proud possessor of cycling's greatest prize. So Bauer has the lead. Neidham drops to second. The favorites have solidified their positions at the top. Kelly, Delgado, and Alcala have moved up, but Andy Hampsten and Laurent Fignon missed today's breakaway and lost more time. And here are the rest of the American riders. So Steve Bauer has the yellow jersey, and we'll see you next Sunday from the Alps. For Phil Liggett, I'm Tim Brandt saying so long from France.
And believe me, cycling up the Alps might be one of the toughest endurance tests in all of sports. But right now, on this shore of the Atlantic, we're getting set for championship boxing. Razai Aluja Bramble, better known as former WBA World Lightweight Champ Livingstone Bramble, against fearless Freddie Pendleton. Gil Clancy will join me at ringside when Sports Sunday continues, live from Atlantic City, after this message from your local station.
No sporting event in the world which captures the imagination of a people like the Tour de France. Million people will stand by the roadsides, stare from their balconies, and crowd the mountain trails, if only for a glimpse of these legends of the road. At stake, a yellow piece of cloth. Since the early 1900s, the month of July belongs to the man who wears yellow. He becomes the most famous man in all of France. He'll be remembered a lifetime. For American Andy Hampsten, it's now or never. If he's to win the Tour de France, it has to be this week. Last year, Spain's Pedro Delgado finished second. Now he's riding to become the first Spaniard to win the Tour since 1973. For two-time champion Laurent Fignon, the mountains could be the beginning of the end. The Alps don't lie. The Colombians are out in force. And their hero, Lucho Herrera, is aiming to become the first South American to ever win the Tour de France. Stadium for it all, the highest mountains in France, with torturous climbs and dangerous descents. Of attrition, where the unlucky are found at the roadside, and the brave fight to survive at all costs. Riders feel compelled to finish. As a cyclist once said, As long as we have our legs, we have no right to stop. The pain never ends. For 21 days and 2,000 miles. It's a real-life horror movie acted out in the peaceful surroundings of picturesque France. 198 of the best cyclists in the world are here to risk it all for this sport's sacred prize. The yellow jersey is up for grabs in the Alps. We are in the Alps, where thousands have gathered from Belgium and Holland, Switzerland and Germany. From all over Europe they've come to see the greatest bicycle race in the world. And hi, everybody, I'm Tim Brandt, and welcome to the second week of our coverage of the Tour de France. The focal point now is in the mountains, as it is every year, because it's here that the pack thins out, that the favorites take control, and the eventual winner of this race will emerge. For Andy Hampsten and Raul Alcala of the American-based 7-Eleven team, climbing is their strength, and they are expected to make their move here in quest for victory in the Tour de France. The 2,000-mile journey began Monday, the 4th of July, in the small town of Pontchâteau. On the coast of Brittany in the west of France, the course went south briefly, crossing the Loire River, before heading in a clockwise direction around France. 198 riders started this race, and rain was to be the theme of week one. The most rain this race has seen since 1980. Rain was not the only problem. The Tour is always the focus of national attention, and a workers' union used this day to exploit it. Once the Tour regrouped, Canadian Steve Bauer broke away from the pack. The 1984 Olympic silver medalist and former teammate of Greg LeMond and Bernard Hinault showed early his intentions of becoming a prominent figure in this year's Tour de France. The native of St. Catharines, Ontario, became the first Canadian to ever win a stage, and it put him in the yellow jersey. Later in day one, the team time trial was held, and the Panasonic team dominated the field. Toon Van Vliet won the yellow, but all eyes were on his teammate, Eric Boyking. Despite the rain, the riders recorded some of the fastest times in Tour history. But for some, the miserable conditions proved difficult and dangerous. The Tour continued east, just north of Paris, toward the Belgian border. The riders had covered 410 miles in 3 days, with more than 1,600 miles to go. Midweek, as the skies finally cleared and the color of France broke through, the pace remained intense. This year's Tour has some of the shortest stages in history, and the riders were forcing the pace every day. Friday, the pressure built as serious racing began with the first of 3 individual time trials. Was the first critical test for American Andy Hampsten. 32 miles on a flat, wind-swept course. Andy Hampsten, known more for his climbing, fared well, losing less than a minute and a half to the favorites. Another climber also did well. Raul Alcala finished 25 seconds ahead of his teammate Hampsten to place himself among the leaders. Spaniard Pedro Delgado, known mostly as a mountain man, showed in this time trial he would be a force. Andy Hampsten continued to garner the attention of the media and race fans alike. Having won the Giro just a month ago, he was now looking to capture the coveted double with a win in France. Eric Boyking, who finished second to Hampsten in the Tour of Italy, remained within striking distance of the lead. But for an old star, it was the beginning of the end. Laurent Fignon, a two-time winner of the Tour de France, lost 6 minutes to the favorite. His health was questioned, but the results were not, and his early exit was a preview of things to come. Jean-Francois Bernard is the rising new star in France, and like many riders, he uses a decongestant to clear his breathing passages. In this race, he would need every edge to accomplish a goal, which has eluded him, a victory in the Tour de France. Jersey on day one of this race began his assault to regain it. Bauer finished the time trial just 1 second from the overall lead. And just 48 hours later, he wore the yellow jersey for the second time in 7 days to end the first week. Heading east toward Strasbourg on the German border, the riders had covered 818 miles, but the race still had over 1,200 miles to go. The most difficult terrain was yet to come, with the Alps and Pyrenees just ahead. After a week of racing in the flatlands of France, the Tour headed toward the mountains. Andy Hampsten found himself in 58th place, but still close to the favorites.
So 2.5 minutes is, you know, it does make a difference, but the race has hardly even started.
CBS Sports Sunday is sponsored by Bud Light. Everything else is just alike. Kellogg's Corn Flakes. What more could you want from a...
This really has been a strange Tour de France this year. The short stages and the shortest race, in fact, since 1905, has made this one of the most competitive events. Gone the friendly atmosphere from that big bunch where the riders enjoyed a joke or two before the real racing has got underway. In fact, every day the racing started right from the beginning. The result, near record speeds in this year's Tour de France. This has suited men who've come to this race with good form, like Steve Bauer of Canada, a rider who doesn't really excel in time trials or climbing or in sprinting, but he's very, very good over the short 4-hour stage. Believe me, this Tour de France is far from over yet. Steve Bauer could only have dreamed of a week like this in the Tour de France. Only a year ago, he was saying how much he hoped he could win a big race. Now he was a favourite. Other favourites, too, are the centre of attraction, and Sean Kelly is always a magnet for the cameras at any start. And if your employer is a coffee producer, then there's time to savour the product. But if you're a European, then perhaps there's a stronger substance just as nice. And before the day's work starts, just time for a read. Even in French, your name's the same. And who cares about the race anyway? Whatever the day in the Tour, the mornings follow the same pattern. The stars draw the attention of a doting French public, and the price of fame is being polite to people you'll never see again. And like everyone who goes to work, not all are sure they're going to have a nice day. The Tour thinks of everything, even a delivery of croissants by bicycle, of course. But at the end of getting ready, the day must eventually begin. And in what has become one of the fastest Tours de France for years, the friendliness and camaraderie of this year's race ends right here. In normal Tours de France, the sight of the official start flag has been an exercise to continue the preamble for a while yet. But this has not been the case this year. Immediately, the attacks warn of a hard day ahead. It's been the same pattern every day. The riders, with no fear of the long road, launch into the race with frightening enthusiasm. The crowds, expecting a slow ride past, have been treated to a high-speed spectacle. And with the result, many have come to grief, including the stars like French favourite Jean-Francois Bernard, who's hurt more than his pride. The great riders are not enjoying this Tour de France. They're finding the pressure all too much. While others, like Charlie Motte, deserve a sense of humour. This is an urgent tour. There's no time to be lost. And if you're unlucky enough to fall, then the helpers are on hand to make sure you stay in the race. Modesty has no part in this tour. Pain certainly has. Change used to be a casual affair in the early part of the day. Now take longer than 10 seconds and you may lose your job. The light lunch is now catch it while you can. You may not be able to snatch the next one. Uh-oh, they're all gone. It's enough to give you indigestion. Riding at a steady rhythm, the Tour de France heads for another day's finish a half an hour ahead of the fastest schedule. Jean-Francois gives his opinion. The domestiques, the worker bees of the peloton, busy themselves at the team cars, their pockets packed with water bottles. The leaders have to keep the reservoirs topped up. A less common sight this year, but there's still some compassion amongst the riders. One rider allowed ahead to stop and say hi. This year, everyone behind is probably pleased as well for the brief drop in the hottest pace for years. But the race still has its adventurers, and any lull in the speed and off they go. This is Valerio Tebaldi from Italy and Philippe Casado, a Frenchman. And sometimes the bunch calls a truce as a pair of unknowns speed ahead. The Tour is built on fearless, or is it foolish moves? And on this day, the Italian-French alliance is made, holding the lead for over 200 kilometres. It's Tebaldi who wins the stage, given a place on the Tour team only a week before the race began. Because of a sick teammate, he wasn't expected to do more than learn. He learned pretty quickly. At 23, the new Italian hope is in no mood now to show the signs of maturity. For the peloton, a routine day in the 1988 Tour de France has ended. For them, no one has slipped the net to finish in front of anyone who matters. All the teams will be happy. But Tebaldi will never forget this day. The first win is always the one you remember most, and after today, the race will remember him. It's stories like this that make these riders in the Tour de France legends of this great race. Tebaldi in tears, a grown man riding his first race and winning a stage, with no hope at all of winning the Tour de France overall. From now on, the riders who are going to try and win this race will be making the headlines. When we return, we'll bring you our first report from the Alps.
Golf, the beauty of the greens, and some of the PGA's brightest stars. The Canon Greater Hartford Open next weekend on CBS Sports.
Welcome back to CBS Sports Sunday coverage of the Tour de France. This is Besançon, the gateway to the Alps. The Tour de France is over halfway to Paris. 7 riders have given up, but the worst is still to come. Andy Hampsten, the winner of the Tour of Italy last month, is America's only hope for victory. Hampsten has arrived at the foot of his favourite terrain, the mountains. He still can win the Tour. Now he must prove it.
Good morning, America.
The yellow jersey has inspired Steve Bauer to great things. He will need more than inspiration to help him here. It's happy time for the climbers, and Pedro Delgado is ready to begin the serious battle. Certainly Delgado's name is on the mind of Hampsten this day, one of many. Unknown 4 years ago, Colombian Lucho Herrera is tense. He's a race favorite now. There's more of a smile on the relaxed face of Mexican Raul Alcala. Best young rider last year. Everybody talks about him as the jewel in the crown of the American 7-Eleven team. France also has its hopes, and Jean-Francois Bernard, bored so far, now has to prove he can better his third place of a year ago. These are tense days, for as the race enters its first mountains, Andy Hampsten is aware of the pressures of being the man to beat. And after 9 days of waiting, the Tour de France is about to begin. It all begins with 144 miles between Besançon to Morzine. The climb of the Pas de Morgin is the sting in the tail. Leaving Besançon over the beautiful River Doubs, the survivors of the Tour de France know that the journey so far has been but a game. The riders carrying hopes of victory have played it all well. Who is the strongest of those who think they can win? For 10 days, the riders have been asking themselves the same question. Today is an hors d'oeuvre. The mountains come near the end of the stage, and they are not the highest peaks, but they are more than a taster for those who think they can win this race. This year's race, the attacks come early, and Ludo Peters from Belgium, a non-climber who once led the Tour briefly in 1982 and 84, tries to steal a march with the little-known Spaniard Juan Martinez Olivier. Together they speed to the Swiss frontier, building a lead of 10 minutes as the pack assesses the attack. Peters, at 34, is in his 9th Tour. He cannot match the climbers, so he tries to beat them to the mountain slope. The suit is on as Delgado's team start the chase. Peters started the day 14 minutes behind Steve Bauer, and Martinez Olivier was almost half an hour back. You can see why the field has not been drawn into a fast reaction. The lead is already 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The field are spending over 3 hours in Switzerland, crossing Lausanne and Montreux, the flatlands before the sting in the tail. Steve Bauer shows the confidence that wearing the most coveted jersey in the world brings. He's not concerned about the two ahead, just about those around him. The field races along the shimmering waters of Lake Geneva. They know there's only one way out, over the mountain called the Pas de Morgin, a climb of 4,500 feet. It is this climb that Peters is trying to reach first. Martinez Olivier has been left. Peters is also concerned about the chase behind. The moment of truth approaches, and Bauer has taken the front. The Canadian is strong, everyone agrees, but alongside him in the white jersey is perhaps the most talented climber in the world, Lucho Herrera. With the mountains forming a backdrop of pain, the race is no longer just for a stage win, it's for the final victory. Another being tested to the full is Andy Hampsten as the race speeds along again at a near-record pace. Laurent Fignon, too, is also content to follow the Canadian, who refuses to give up his lead easily. Peters is still ahead, his lead of 12 minutes reduced to 5 as the Valley Road begins to climb back to France. Hampsten still together with the leaders as the road steepens. Raul Alcala is also there. But at the top, the cheers are for Peters, a cheeky Belgian whose experience has won the day as he crosses the summit 3 minutes ahead of a field that is at last making its choice. Missing from the chase group are two important names, Jean-Francois Francois Bernard and Sean Kelly. Both left on the Pas de Morgin. The Tour has delivered its first big shock. Britain's Robert Miller leads the chase after Peters with one more climb before the finish of Morzine. 50 miles an hour descent soon provokes another attack that will change the result this day. Fabio Parra, the first real favourite to show interest in Tour victory. Back in the pack, Delgado still waits behind. So too Herrera and the yellow jersey Bauer. As the two leaders approach the Col du Corbière, Peters is passed as if he's standing still. There's still 13 miles to go. The Col du Corbière at 4,100 feet is the final stepping stone. A left turn onto the climb, and Parra makes his move. Freeing himself from his tired teammate, he concentrates on making time over all his rivals to Tour victory. At last, Parra is able to ride his own race, attacking the real leaders of this Tour, and the Tour organisation seem just as pleased. But for some, it was coming to an end. Laurent Fignon, his Tour de France will soon be over. We'll be back.
It's time.
A mile below the shrouded peaks, and some 20 miles before the day's finish in Morzine, the first Alpine stage was leaving an indelible imprint on this Tour de France. The Colombian mountain specialist, Fabio Parra, had taken a commanding lead in the final climb, which in any other year would not surprise anyone. But lost in the echo of the crowd's deafening roar was any mention of the names that all of France had hoped would make headlines in this Tour. Jean-Francois Bernard, the pre-Tour favorite, was an astounding 2 minutes behind the other leaders. The collapse came much too soon for a man who was the protege of Bernard Hinault. The Irishman, Sean Kelly, had never won a Tour because he was never a great climber. Yet by virtue of his #1 ranking, he was considered a favorite. But already over 2 minutes back, he was never again to be mentioned among the favorites. For France, it was hoped that Laurent Fignon would somehow resurrect himself to the level he once held only a few years ago. With almost blind hope, the Frenchman believed he would once again dominate the race he had already won twice. But struggling, barely staying on his bike, their only hope now was that he'd soon quit and reduce the embarrassment of being left to linger in the back of the pack. This Tour so far has shown the effects of not having a true leader of the peloton. It was hoped that a Frenchman would emerge in that role. However, it was quite clear this early on that any hopes of that happening had evaporated, leaving France with only heroes past, with nostalgic looks back to a time that had passed them by. Fignon would later say that if his hotel was on the route, he'd have quit. Even his teammates passed him by, leaving behind not just a man, but an era. The new era includes Colombians like Fabio Parra, who feel at home in the mountains. These strong climbers made their first Tour appearance in 1983 and are now carving their niche in a race which traditionally belonged to the French. And the yellow jersey on this day would be worn by a Canadian, Steve Bauer, who, breaking with tradition, was joined on the podium by his wife. Yet another symbol of changing times. 12 minutes back, Fignon continued to struggle, earning the applause of fans more out of respect and reputation than his performance on this day. And so the standings after stage 11 show only one Frenchman near the top, Charles Motet. For Andy Hampsten, 4 minutes and 14 seconds back. As the leader, did Bauer surprise the favorites on this day? We asked the Canadian.
I think they realize that I'm riding very strong, and I don't think they really raced against me. You know, they were looking at each other, you know, like Delgado, Zimmerman, Afson. The best looked at each other. You know, I did my own race, and I ended up finishing the best. You know, I don't think they attacked for me to lose the jersey because they have other riders to worry about besides me.
The next morning, the race to Alpe d'Huez, the hardest stage in the Alps. And American Andy Hampsten was cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I'm coming around. Everyone's getting tired, including myself, but I felt pretty good on the climb yesterday. I'm starting to find my climbing legs. Might really find out today if it's going to happen or not for me.
We'll be back to the Tour de France after this commercial message and a word from your local stations.
Okay, so you love your car. Whoa. You're not going inside yet. The tires, the 4 round things underneath. There you go. Now,
cycling has become a sophisticated sport, and for years at the Tour de France, we've showed you the new technology. From equipment to clothing, it's state-of-the-art, all in the name of aerodynamics and speed. One of the latest advancements has nothing to do with spokes and sprockets. It's an explosion of sorts. Everywhere you turn, there's a souped-up, well-designed team bus. Some of the most famous riders on the tour now get to the race in vehicular style. Teams use them as portable bicycle repair shops. Over a third of the teams on the tour now have these buses, with more sure to follow, since the rolling tour is getting rave reviews.
Music, we can watch a video, and it's good for your mind, so I think it's more important to travel this way in a fine bus than in the normal car.
The bus is not only for to transport the riders from the hotels to the finish and back, but he's always doing a promotion tour every year.
These aren't the kind of buses you catch at a bus stop. These luxury vehicles cost $500,000. There are 3 motors to turn on the bus, for electricity, and yet another for air conditioning. But the best thing about these buses, you never have to worry about having exact change. These rolling symbols of success have all the comforts of home and then some. Dressed with all the necessities, including running water. It has all the conveniences, like a video machine for the favorite movies. And of course the fridge and microwave for refreshments. This is more than just a way to travel through Europe from race to race. For some, it's an upgraded way of life.
It's my home. I live in this bus 300 days a year. And it's better than a hotel room. Good beds and a good shower, and I like the Dutch coffee, and I have a Dutch coffee machine aboard, and I can make my own food. It's special. It's like a holiday.
It's not holiday. It's very hard work. And then I tell it every day you do the same. Then you know it is like a robot.
The bus is also home to the mechanics, who carry more than a half-ton of parts and equipment worth over $100,000. Every conceivable bike component and mechanic's tool can be found in this organized mobile workshop. And while they're repairing bicycles on the outside of a bus, there's always domestic work to be done inside. After all, running a bus, training a team, and repairing bikes can be dirty work. The most exact and tedious adjustments can be made under the most watchful eye. Every day after the race, each bicycle is taken apart piece by piece. The mechanics clean them, adjust them, and build them back like new for the next day's competition. The bus buses seem perfect. With all this, what more could they want?
A helicopter to transport them. Maybe it's coming, but I think it will take another 5 years.
Well, maybe they want to have the bar bigger. The bar is a little bit too small.
But now the bus is off to Alpe d'Huez, where comfort no longer applies, and the riders will face perhaps the most difficult day of the Tour de France.
The most romantic climb of the Tour de France in recent times has been the mountain known as Alpe d'Huez. At a little more than 6,000 feet, it's not the highest, but it's certainly the cruelest. From the village of Bourg d'Oisans, each hairpin bend is numbered from 21 at the bottom to number 1 at the top. And 2 miles from the summit, the village of Huez has all too often been the graveyard for those who tried to get to the top of the 9 miles drunken road to nowhere. The road was first discovered by the Tour in 1952. Its steep slopes, which incidentally helped the great Italian Fausto Coppi to victory then, were forgotten by the Tour for the next 24 years. We first saw the climb in 1983 when Laurent Fignon, wearing the white jersey of best young rider here, was surprising everyone by matching Belgian champion Lucien Bonhomme. Another man made his mark that day as well, Pedro Delgado, the man in blue, who led Fignon up the mountain. Fignon arrived to win the Tour leader's yellow jersey, and his first Tour de France, France had found a new name to worship. In 1984, Fignon was back as the champion of France, but this time he was up against the greatest rider of his time, Bernard Hinault. Fignon, the defending Tour champion, repeated history, passing Hinault and again winning the lead on Alpe d'Huez. This same year, the mountain was again revered, this time by Colombia, who celebrated their first ever victory when Luis Herrera made it up there first. Then in 1986, the most amazing sight of all, an American, Greg LeMond in yellow, and Bernard Hinault had climbed the mountain together, destroying the field in front of an enormous crowd. The Tour was given its most incredulous finish. And so to the man of the Alps, Pedro Delgado in 1986. Saddened by the death of his mother, he quit the Tour on his way to Alpe d'Huez when lying 5th overall. He was back in 1987, driven on by the memory of his mother. Delgado was an untouchable force. By the top, he had won the yellow jersey and immediately dedicated to his mother's memory. The man who had lost the day was Stephen Roche. He would win the Tour later. Delgado is a rider who knows the sadness and the happiness of Alpe d'Huez. This wonderful mountain has been conquered only by the best riders in the world. It's feared by them all.
CBS Sports Sunday continues its coverage of the Tour de France in the Alps. Welcome to Morzine and the start of the most difficult day in the Alps. Before this day ends, the riders will have taken on 3 major mountains before ending in Alpe d'Huez. And that road to Alpe d'Huez is legendary. Traditionally, it offers some of the most difficult climbs in the Tour de France. But one thing is certain, past winners have never failed here, which means those riders that survive today and finish near the front are certain to be favorites next week in Paris as this race comes to a conclusion. Despite the torturous ride ahead, Andy Hampton looked as happy as he's looked in 10 days of this race. Even though he's lost some time, he's back in his element as a climber now that the Tour has reached the Alps. A rider who should be concerned is Steve Bauer, the man who owns the yellow jersey. Climbing is not his strength, and he could lose the maillot jaune. A man certainly known for his climbing talents and a rider due attention is the Spaniard Pedro Delgado, who finished second last year. Though he's remained almost anonymous to this point, he is capable of turning this race upside down in a single mountain stage.
Correre en bicicleta, seguro.
After an impressive win on the stage to Morzine yesterday, the affable Fabio Paro appeared relaxed, ready to ride again, greeting riders as they signed in. Paro is certainly capable of winning 2 days in a row. If there's a dark horse, watch Paro. As usual before a major race, Lucho Herrera is very much alone with himself. The Colombian favorite is perhaps thinking of how he can explode the Tour in the Alps. Jean-François Bernard, he's got a problem.
Il est où le camion? Il est devant là. Oh, c'est marqué. J'arrive.
He can't afford to be anything less than 100%. So the stage is set. The riders now begin their journey. It's 141 miles from Morzine to Aptuez. It's also July 14th, Bastille Day, and flag waving by the French champion was the only sign of festivity among the serious faces on this crucial race day. The ceremonial rollout took the riders through the small ski village to the outskirts of town. It's here that the race officially begins. It starts with the descent. That in itself is unusual for any stage of the Tour de France. The course takes the riders over the foothills of the Alps before reaching the three biggest climbs thus far. Descent at 60 miles per hour is a heck of a way to start your morning. This ride through the mountains is not for mere thrill seekers. Everyone survived the hair-raising descent. Up ahead, the first climb. And the pack rides together. Finally, three men break away on the first major climb. Among them, Urs Zimmermann, the Swiss favorite. Jeff Pierce, a pretty good climber himself, stays close, perhaps to keep an eye on Zimmermann for teammates Andy Hampsten and Raul Alcala. After 9 days of posturing, this will be remembered as the first major move in this Tour de France.
Behind, the pack assessed the move and was also making its selection. Those who felt they had a chance were holding their position in the front. Andy Hampsten was there. The lush green Alps are littered with roads lying on the mountainside like discarded string. All have stories to tell. With memories of only a year ago when he collapsed on these roads in tears, Urs Zimmermann was trying again to beat the Alps. The Swiss do not enjoy great success in the Tour, despite their mountainous countryside. Zimmermann is aware of his responsibility. Followed by Jeff Pierce and Henry Cadena, with neither willing to help a key rival escape too far, Zimmermann has to make all of the running. Never far behind, the relentless pursuit continues at its own steady pace. With two climbs ahead, it's too early to use up too much energy. On this first climb, it's a case of see how it goes. After an hour on the mountain road, the three riders went over the top first. And the the peloton behind had made a natural selection. 32 men had climbed away from the rest. This was all that could now be considered as the elite of the Tour de France. Andy Hampsten was still among them. In just an hour, the mountain had done what 10 days couldn't: break the pack. Descending at 50 miles an hour, Zimmermann was testing himself and the race. Pierce and Cadenas were wise not to follow too closely. Dumped on the verge, Zimmermann, too anxious to establish a lead, had paid the price. And behind, the chasers were topping the climb, now showing far more urgency. A 12 miles descent would bring the riders to two of the most feared mountains in the Alps, the Col de Glandon and the Alpe d'Huez itself. Today's stage has yet to begin. We'll be back.
Performance. For some people, it's more than a passion. It's a way of life.
These are the Alps, the ultimate challenge in the second week of the Tour de France. After the climb of the Col de la Madeleine, those who search for the greatest reward in world cycling have taken command. Pedro Delgado, second a year ago and who's seen here in blue without the hat, is being escorted by surprisingly two Dutchmen. Steven Rooks on the far left and Gert Turney's the man with the flowing hair. And if you're going to make your move on the mountain, the place is up front. Steve Bauer, the brilliant Canadian who has so far ridden an inspired Tour to lead for almost a week. Now he's fallen back on this wall of a mountain they call the Col de Glandon. The weight of leadership is proving too heavy. Bauer has surprised everybody except himself. He's been a good leader because he's tried to go with every crucial move. Zimmermann, who led the way on the last climb, has also paid the price. The legs have turned to rubber and his effort reduced to survival. The great French hope, Jean-Francois Bernard, also feels the pain of carrying the hopes of France. Third a year ago, the Alps are proving an impossible barrier. He'll not challenge today. The last 2 miles of the Col de Glandon are steeper than anything so far, and Pedro Delgado makes his move. Only Steven Rooks can follow the Spanish climber. Setting a remorseless pace before an audience of thousands, the question everyone should ask: has the move been made too soon? And who is Steven Rooks? Not far behind, Andy Hampsten will soon realize whether he is to win or lose this Tour. It's decision time for everybody today as the two leaders top the Glandon, with still the worst climb to come. And newspaper to isolate the chest from the chill mountain air. Rooks and Delgado are making the headlines now. But Raul Alcala has climbed with distinction so far, and to pass a faltering climbing specialist like Lucho Herrera is a good sign for Mexico's only star as he heads towards the roller coaster road that still lies ahead. Rooks descends with Delgado, perhaps remembering last year when they were on the same PDM team. Now they're rivals. Behind, top the Glandon, gasping for air. Alcala is at the back, but Herrera delivers a surprise. The Colombian ace seems to be in trouble. The leaders speed towards their next appointment, across the valley. While Herrera fights back into contention on a day he was expected to be handing out the pain to others. Andy Hampsten is also resisting. So too the Colombian rival of Herrera, Fabio Parra. And it's Raul Alcala who leads the pursuit of the Spanish-Dutch tandem.
Following the progress of the race at the mountaintop is only possible by radio. For spectators, as they wait for their all-too-short glimpse at the riders. For cycling fans, standing or laying at the top of the mountain is the equivalent to a seat on the 50-yard line. Except here, it's first come, first served. Do you ever wonder how people get to the top of these monstrous mountains to watch the Tour de France? Well, unless you got there days early in a van or a car and camped out, or if you're an official of the race or working the race, well, the only way to do it is park your car way down the bottom and walk for miles and miles and miles. Comment ça va? Ça va. Bonjour. Bonjour. It's tough, but these people love the Tour de France. It's too tough for me, I'll tell you, and that's why it's on days like this, I'm glad I'm working. I'll see you at the top. Allez.
There's no such luxury as a car for the Spanish flyer Pedro Delgado. Free from the pack for the first time, he and Stephen Rooks, the man who has taken on the leadership of the PDM team in the absence of American Greg LeMond, are being drawn towards Alpe d'Huez, the last rendezvous of a vicious day. The 16 chasers now know that the attack by Delgado and Rooks towards the top of the Col de Glandon was a serious move, and in these last 15 miles they must hurt their bodies like never before. This first full day in the heart of the French Alps has enabled Delgado to unleash the frustration of more than 1,000 miles spent pedaling over flatter roads. But so often in the past, riders who've attacked before the climb of Alpe d'Huez have ended the day lying exhausted amongst the rocks of this ultimate challenge. Andy Hampton and his 7-Eleven team have also done well, but there's more urgency now as the Alpe d'Huez approaches. Team manager Mike Neal keeps both of his men informed. He has 2 cars in a rapidly dwindling deck. Yellow jersey Steve Bauer is also back. It's true what they say, the jersey makes you ride like 2 men. But these two, held by a tailwind along the valley road, show no signs of slowing down. On these flat roads, Rooks feels at home, and the Dutchman is always willing to help beat the rest. Pedro Delgado sold newspapers to buy his first bike, and he's talked all year of only one thing, victory in the Tour de France. It's no secret anymore. No Spaniard has won the Tour since 1973, and only 2 have succeeded since the race began in 1903. After the valley, the climb itself. When we come back, Alpe d'Huez, the most unsociable monster in the Alps, will be with us.
That's it? That's all?
We're on the final climb to Alpe d'Huez. The riders of the Tour de France have been on the road for over 6 hours, and these are the 2 men who have so far destroyed the field. Pedro Delgado in blue and Stephen Rooks. All that remains now is the 9 miles climb to the ski stop of Alpe d'Huez. American Andy Hampton still refuses to concede defeat, and along the valley he makes ready for the final assault. The final climb will decide many things. Fabio Parra, Luis Herrera, 2 Colombians always refusing to give up. Raul Alcala, and the yellow jersey of Canada's Steve Bauer, all in the chase group. The early part of Alpe d'Huez is said to be the hardest. It's unbelievably steep and cruel. Yet, Delgado, winner of the yellow jersey in memory of his mother a year ago, is in the position now to win it again. And this time, he means to keep it. Alongside him, Rooks continues to surprise. He's never shown any signs of cracking all day. Steve Bauer has got this far among the leaders, but at last his legs begin to tire, and he starts to fall away. The original 16 have splintered, and Andy Hampton has taken the first chase group with Gert Turney's and climber Luis Herrera on the right. The 2 leaders ride almost directly above the chasers now, who are beginning at last to close the gap as the finish comes closer. Of them both, Rooks, his face a poker-like expression, looks the best of them. Across the valley, their lead was 3 minutes. On the climb, it's down to just 1. in the hope the leaders will slow as he continues to follow the strong men of this tour. He can take confidence in the thought that Herrera, the winner here in 1984, is in trouble. This is perhaps the finest ever battle of Alpe d'Huez. So many believe they could win. Now Hampsten just hopes he can survive. How much longer will the pain last? Delgado seems to be tiring, but it looks as though Hampsten is in even more difficulty as his arms, back and legs all ache together. Hampsten tries to shut the thought of pain away as he has shut the gap to just 30 seconds. Here he holds the wheels of Ternís and the pace setter, the Spaniard Pino. Up front for the second year, Delgado is being annoyed by a rider wearing number 11. Last year it was Stephen Roach, now it's Stephen Rooks. Hampsten, with still 6 miles to climb, holds on, but cannot contribute to the chase. The American has raced to his limit. Bauer, the determination that has kept him ahead so long, is still there. He's not given up, but instead, climbing at his own speed, he's recovering and may yet return to the leaders. The two ahead are showing at last fatigue. Having broken clear on the Col du Glandon, the slopes of Alpe d'Huez could stop them yet. Pino, Ternís and Hampsten have never given up hope of catching the leaders. But Hampsten, with 5 miles to climb, is forced to his limits and no more is possible. The American has to let the others go. It's 2 against 2 as the race turns towards the finish. On the mountaintop, the reservation of Alpe d'Huez awaits the winner. A friendly word of encouragement for Hampsten to keep up. He'll need more than that. Even on this climb, too, men are recovering and Fabio Parra is on his way back to the front. Hampsten is his first target as he moves towards the head of the race. For the young man from Boulder, Colorado, this year's quest for the yellow jersey is over. Unaware of the battle behind, Rooks continues to drive the breakaway. On this mountain, by tradition, every year, there are more Dutch and Spanish supporters than there are French. Hampsten continues to fall back, and such a climber of his talent would never have expected to see the yellow jersey of Steve Bauer passing him as well. The mountains are great levelers, and Bauer still carries hope of keeping his lead. This day in the Alps has left Andy Hampsten without hope of anything. Joined Ternís, and now the next target are the leaders themselves. There's still time to win.
Steve Bauer was being encouraged by the fans and inspired by the yellow jersey, was riding desperately now to hold on. With the summit in sight, the leaders were nearly stopped when the roadway became clogged. They were losing time. It was precious time that Steve Bauer needed to hold on to his yellow jersey, but fatigue overcame inspiration. He blew up and lost almost a minute in the final mile. Entering the ski village of Alpe d'Huez, and just a half mile from the finish, the leaders allowed Stephen Rooks to break away, feeling he was not a serious threat for the yellow jersey. After 141 miles and 3 major mountain passes, Rooks was about to win the most demanding stage in the Alps. Nobody knew where Andy Hampsten would finish. For the man who was slated to merely assist Greg LeMond on the PDM team, Rooks was a surprising winner in Alpe d'Huez. Or was he? Of the 12 times the Tour de France has come to this resort, this marked the 6th victory by a Dutchman. Pedro Delgado finished 17 seconds after Rooks, and for the 2nd year in a row, he took over the yellow jersey in Alpe d'Huez. Delgado had conquered the Alps, while so many other favorites self-destructed. On this day, Delgado devastated the field. The standings after stage 12 show time gaps no one would have predicted, leaving only a few other riders in contention for the yellow jersey. It was in 1986 here in Alpe d'Huez that Pedro Delgado suffered the greatest tragedy of his life when he learned of the death of his mother. Now on the same mountaintop, his lifelong dream of winning the Tour was well within reach. But a demanding mountain time trial was still ahead. And we'll be back after this word from your local stations.
Nights at 7:30.
After the cruel Alpine crossing to Alpe d'Huez Thursday, the Tour de France returned down the mountain to Grenoble, ready to go up yet another climb in the Tour's 2nd time trial of the race. 24 miles of lone effort where the clock never lies. Today, the only chance they have of catching up is to do the fastest time to the top. Andy Hampsten is over 6 minutes now behind the leader, Pedro Delgado, who is the target.
I need a great day. I need, I'm not looking to be hunting down. I'm not looking for seconds. I need to do something extraordinary. So I'm either going to be out of sight or he's not going to have to worry about me.
Time waits for no one as each rider takes his turn in the start house. Stephen Rooks, 4th overall, is 98 seconds behind Delgado. Delgado is the man to beat now, and Stephen Rooks can only agree.
Today is also a big day for me. I'm 4 in the Barcelona, and I want to try to keep the first 5.
Time is running out for the stars. Raul Alcala hopes for a good ride to salvage any chance to stay in the race. Delgado does too, but for a different reason. Now the Spaniard appears in total control, relaxed and confident on a normally tense day. It may be a last chance for everyone. Luis Herrera, Fabio Parra, and Steve Bauer. Delgado has pushed them all into the back seat. Delgado is the driving force now. His confidence such he doesn't think about 1987 when, wearing the leader's yellow jersey, he lost the deciding time trial and the race to Stephen Roach of Ireland. Within the first 5 miles today, Delgado is already ahead of everyone in the race. Andy Hampsten, struggling to find a rhythm, is losing time steadily. After his Tour of Italy win, this tour has been too hard. It's the same story for everyone. Raul Alcala, now wearing the white jersey of Best Young Rider, a competition he won last year as well. Even with his best effort, he's also losing time. Luis Herrera, who cracked in the mountains yesterday, is showing no signs of recovery either. The hot favourite, the French called him the Menace only days before. But what of the champion of Alpe d'Huez, the surprise of this tour? Stephen Rooks still surprises. Even though he's losing a minute to Delgado, he's the best of the rest who fight for a top finish in Paris. Clawing his way up the mountain climb, Fabio Parra still hopes to become the best Colombian finisher. This seems his only target now as he too falls back. Pedro Delgado was the last man to start in Grenoble, and choosing a disc wheel, heavier perhaps, but once it's rolling, set to produce greater speed, he continues to annihilate all who ride in front of him. Andy Hampsten has tried his best. You can't do more than that. But on this occasion, it may not be good enough.
At the finish line, Raul Alcala was to finish strongly, but still lose almost 4 minutes to Delgado, while Andy Hampsten was now struggling to the summit. Pedro Delgado, like a man on a mission, was showing no signs of slowing up. The Spaniard from Segovia was riding the finest time trial of his life and heading toward the most important victory of his career. Redemption at last for his failure in the time trial last year, where he lost the Tour de France. There was to be no miracle in the mountains for Hampsten this day. Instead, he finished only 13 seconds ahead of his teammate Alcala, but lost almost 4 minutes to Delgado. Stephen Rooks rode to a surprising third-place finish, but he too was crushed by the Spaniard, as was Steve Bauer, who had relinquished his yellow jersey the day before. Delgado, who passed through every checkpoint with the fastest time, was now adding emphasis to his victory. The man who lost the race on the final time trial to Stephen Roche a year ago may now have very well won this race on the mountaintop in Villard-de-Lans. And so the standings at the end of day 12 have the Spaniard devastating the field. The closest competitor, 2 minutes and 47 seconds back. For Andy Hampsten, 10th place with a virtually impossible 10 minutes and 7 seconds to make up. And so for Pedro Delgado, only disaster in the Pyrenees now could prevent him from reaching his lifelong dream of victory in the Tour de France. The man who desperately wanted that yellow jersey is Andy Hampsten, who now has only a slim chance of victory.
I'm in there, but I just don't feel I need a tremendous day. And things just aren't quite right for me in this race. And, you know, some like the Tour, if you don't really have everything, it doesn't happen.
Yesterday, Andy Hampsten and the rest of the riders had the day off. But today, they were back in the mountains. And we'll bring you that when we return.
How can you improve something this great, like Thompson's Water Seal? Well, Thompson's could apply itself, or keep any rain from hitting your house. Instead, we've made it waterproof better. Introducing new and improved Thompson's Water Seal. 50% more active ingredients now protect wood, brick, and concrete from water damage with a lot more waterproofing power. So if you thought Thompson's couldn't be improved, we proved it could be. Thompson's, the first name in lasting protection.
Hi there. You looking for Mr. Wright?
Give this guy a light and butter.
Yesterday was the first and only day off for the riders, a travel day, and the cyclists were to fly the 400 miles from Grenoble to Toulouse. And each rider found his own way to escape the drudgery of the trip. It was open seating, so most wanted to board early. But the Americans were in no hurry at all. As a matter of fact, the son of 2 English professors used this time to read.
You don't have to go through security, really.
The 179 cyclists who remain in this race boarded the Airbus for the hour-long flight. Only passenger Delgado had packed the yellow jersey. But even he was flying coach. Hey, they seem to be having fun in the cheap seats.
Pasa, hombre, pasa.
The tour organizers arranged this flight in an effort to make the race even tougher, effectively making the Alps and Pyrenees one continuous mountain range for the riders.
Today's 101-mile stage to the Pyrenees started from the same place as where the riders landed from the Alps yesterday. The rollout was along the airfield, the flattest of the roads this day. And the field past the original concourse, now a museum piece. Tour de France, entering its third week, was again ready for takeoff. And in the opening miles, the field were in no mood to attack on the hot day. It would soon be even hotter as the mountains appeared. The mountains that divide France and Spain, The mountains that hadn't stopped thousands of Spaniards crossing the sea. Pedro Delgado, the dominant leader of the Tour. But it was a tense and nervous day, and a crash put Raul Alcala behind. But his teammates were on hand to help him out. The chase will be hard. Cars crashed too. It was one of those days today. The PDM backup team were not having such a good time as the riders. While the pack moved on, the American 7-Eleven team nursed Alcala back into the race. And as the mountains approach, 13 riders have broken clear. None are a danger to the race leader, Delgado. The field stayed together behind over the Col d'Agnes with just the final climb to Couzenays to come. Pedro Delgado has not been challenged all day, and the last climb now awaits him. On the climb, 3 riders break clear of the original 13, but then came a confusing end to today's stage of the Tour de France. A police signal is misunderstood. And Italy's Massimo Garotto comes from behind to win the stage. Britain's Robert Miller returns on course too late. Another mountain stage ends, and Pedro Delgado keeps his yellow jersey.
So as you look at the final standings with 1 week to go, Pedro Delgado has the yellow jersey. Brooks and Bauer are within 4 minutes. Andy Hampsten and Raul Alcala a whopping 11 minutes off the pace. There's another race in France, and the Women's Tour de France has Jeannie Longo dominating the field. And as we look at the standings in the women's field, she is 40 seconds over Maria Cannons, and American Betsy King is 12:45 back. So we'll see you next week in Paris. For Phil Liggett, I'm Tim Brandt saying so long from France. Don't forget tonight on CBS, 60 Minutes, followed by Murder, She Wrote, and the CBS Sunday movie, Trapped in Silence.
CBS Sports Sunday has been sponsored by Bud Light.
Nonsense pledge makes buying a car from us easy. For instance,
we're overstocked. New, used, demos, trucks, 500 vehicles must go. July 18th to the 25th.
So come to Manhattan Ford, Mercury, Lincoln for a good deal.
The Tour de France is the most colorful free spectacle in the world. Each July, nearly 30 million people line the roads of France for this traveling show. It's the largest captive audience of any single event in the world. On center stage is the man who wears the yellow jersey as the leader of this great race. In 1988, it's Pedro Delgado who wears the badge of honor. And he's learned that the yellow jersey carries with it a tremendous burden, and the responsibility, like a demon, takes over the man who wears it, transforming even the most mild-mannered of men and pushing them to the edge of control. Delgado is now revered as a superhero. But with the adulation comes the responsibility of bearing up under the microscopic scrutiny of the masses. And his accomplishments this week were overshadowed by drug accusations. This week, it's the Pyrenees. Where the crowds are the biggest. It's where the heat is the most searing. And it's where mistakes are most punishing. Appeared invincible is Spain's Pedro Delgado. The most threatening rival has been Fabio Parra, who thrives on grueling mountain climbs. But the biggest surprise of this race has been the Dutchman, Steven Rooks. 3 weeks ago, he was considered a Dom Mystique. Now he's looked upon as a serious contender. And for American Andy Hampsten, he's been beaten down by the mountains and trails the leader by more than 11 minutes. 179 of the best cyclists in the world about to conclude their pilgrimage in Paris. Welcome to Paris and the 75th edition of the Tour de France. After 21 days and over 2,000 miles, this great race is about to conclude here on the Champs-Élysées. And hi, everybody, I'm Tim Brandt. It's been a very explosive and emotional week in the Tour de France. The man who wears the yellow jersey was charged with illegal drug use. Now, those charges have evaporated, and Pedro Delgado has been exonerated. But those charges have now had an ill effect on this race. Working with me, my colleague, Phil Liggett. And Phil, you've covered this race for 16 years. What are your impressions of this situation?
Tim, I think it's a great shame for Pedro Delgado that such a cloud has come over the Tour de France and his yellow jersey is leader of this race, simply because he's done nothing at all wrong in this race. He has abided by all the rules of world cycling, and the organization have tried to accuse him of taking dope. I think it's very, very poor.
All right, we'll have the complete story of Pedro Delgado a little bit later in the show. But right now, let's take you back where this journey began, day one. Every year, the course for this great race changes, and the 75th edition of the Tour de France began on the west coast of France on the 4th of July. It all started in the small historic town of Pontchâteau on the west coast of Brittany. The race headed south briefly before heading northeast, moving clockwise around France. 198 riders started this 2,000-mile journey in the wettest weather this race had experienced since 1980. Canadian Steve Bauer broke from the pack, and the 1984 Olympic silver medalist and former teammate Greg LeMond and Bernard Hinault showed early his intentions of becoming a prominent figure in this year's race. He became the first Canadian to ever win a stage, and it put him in the yellow jersey at the end of day one. After 4 days of rather uneventful riding, the race had covered 410 miles. There were still 17 days and more than 1,600 miles yet to go. The course took the cyclist through the industrial heartland of France, north toward the Belgian border. Attention focused on Andy Hampsten due to his Tour of Italy win, and the American climber held his own. Another climber, Pedro Delgado, delivered a message as he too showed well on the flat wind-swept course. The hope of France was Jean-Francois Bernard, who looked for an edge and used a decongestant to clear his breathing passages. The wet weather and quick pace of week one made racing extremely dangerous and painful. After 6 days of racing through the flatlands of France, the Tour headed toward its first hills. There were still 1,200 miles of the toughest racing yet to come. Heading south along the German border toward Switzerland, the riders pushed on to the Alps. Steve Bauer owned the yellow jersey for 5 of the first 11 days. The Tour moved briefly into Switzerland and around Lake Geneva before climbing into the Alps. It was over these massive mountains the true favorites were to take control, and we'd get our first indications of who would be in the position to win the 1988 Tour de France. Too many merged. On the tortuous road to Alpe d'Huez, it was Pedro Delgado of Spain and Steven Rooks of Holland. Colombian Fabio Parra, who had won a stage in the hills to Morzine earlier in the week, was again a force. But for Steve Bauer, fatigue overtook inspiration of the coffee war. He lost his yellow jersey, and his dream of victory ended in the Alps. Andy Hampsten's attempt to catch the favorites also failed. He fell 6.5 minutes behind the leaders. On day 12, in the second individual time trial, Pedro Delgado, who had taken the yellow jersey, crushed the rest of the field on the steep climb to Villard-de-Lans. The only rest day of the Tour, the riders had to fly from one mountain range to another, thus making the course more difficult. The Tour de France had now covered 1,321 miles, but there were still 721 more miles to go, with some of the steepest climbs yet to come. The riders began in the same place they had landed the day before. The pack, which rode together as one, was sure to split once it felt the first ripples of anger from the Pyrenees. Skirting the Spanish border, the riders were to face their final big test. 5 major climbs in the rise to Les Ardennes. Early this week, it was a welcome exit from the Pyrenees through the flat vineyards of Bordeaux. The race ended high on the volcanic remains of La Puy-de-Dôme. And like the Tour de France started, it is ending with a flat, rather routine ride. Last night, the riders took a train 120 miles to today's start line. And today, the final stage to Paris, a day of honor for the leader of the greatest race in the world. The Tour de France has taken these cyclists over 2,000 miles in 21 days. The greatest bicycle race in the world will arrive here in Paris shortly, so stay with us as CBS Sports Sunday continues. And it's the setting for the most difficult day of racing in this year's Tour. If anyone is to beat Pedro Delgado, these mountains offer the last chance. Privacy is impossible when you wear the yellow jersey, but while all the attention focused on Pedro Delgado, the leader focused on the mountain road ahead, ending in Les Ardennes. The biggest surprise of the race continued to be the Dutchman, Steven Rooks. He was only 3.5 minutes behind Delgado and wearing the jersey as the best climber in this race. But in fact, the Tour's most threatening climber was Fabio Parra, who was not in the mood for socializing. Raul Alcala wore the white jersey as the Tour's best young rider, but he hadn't lived up to expectations. And Andy Hampsten knows his chance of winning the Tour is over. But he relishes the thought of winning this stage, where the climbs are the toughest.
So far, doing great so far.
The small town of Saint-Giron, with its 8,000 population, lies in the low country between the majestic Pyrenees and the flatlands. It was from here that the most feared day in the Tour de France was to begin. The riders who had survived the opening week in northern France, the second week in the Alps, now move slowly towards their destiny, the highest mountains of the race. The route covers 117 miles across 5 mountain peaks before the end at Luz Ardiden. It was a day to be spent climbing 19,000 feet in the next 6 hours. In these opening miles, the only flat ones of the day, no one was in any hurry to race into the Pain barrier. The survivors of the Tour de France rode closer together, not for warmth, but just to stay together before the hills begin. As the roads begin to resist the riders in the Tour de France, the first climb, the 3,500 feet, Col du Portet d'Aspet, is respected, and the leaders keep a tempo that most can match. Stephen Rook, second in the race overall, on the left. He watches the towns below get smaller, while Lucho Herrera from Colombia dances to the rhythm, once again riding on his favorite terrain. Had never looked more beautiful. Bathed in hot sunshine, it was the perfect weather for a tour, but not the bicycling kind. At the top, Stephen Brooks is first with the yellow jersey of Pedro Delgado close up. The field had stayed together, showing respect to the mountain roads. Worse, much worse, was to come soon. For some, sooner rather than later. A crash as the descent began, and Eric Breking, the Dutch hope, is injured. So too is 7-Eleven's Jeff Pierce, the winner of the final stage in Paris a year ago. Pierce's teammate Jens Veggerby is also down on a sharp turn. Tour de France is not selective in who it chooses as its victims. Eric Breking now lives up to his reputation as a future Tour winner. One ability you must have is courage. Breking has that today. The same too must be said of Veggerby. Torn and bleeding, he too races back to the race ahead.
While some riders fought to get back on their bikes, Jean-Francois Bernard was about to get off his. Carrying the legacy of France had proven too difficult a task. He failed in the mountains, trailed by 35 minutes, and he abandoned. For 15 days, he had carried the banner of being the successor of Bernard Hinault. Exalted by the press as the next hero of France, he had been built up only to be beaten down, and emotionally he was shattered.
Maillot jaune se rapproche à présent de Pascal Simon.
The man who had dreams of cycling down the Champs-Élysées, wearing the yellow jersey, would now lead in the team car on a back road of Luchon, France.
La nevera tipo americano. Vamos, dale, Parra. Ale, ale.
The language of success in this race, Spanish.
Vamos a ver qué pasa en la punta, Alberto. Vamos al 1. La moto ya está ubicada para dar el premio de montaña, padrino.
And with so many successful riders, they want everybody for miles to know it. The story of this race was being written by the Spaniard, Pedro Delgado, who continued to ride strongly and control the field. But with 2 major climbs still to come, his lead was still tenuous, and the thinning atmosphere of the High Pyrenees was now enhancing the burning heat of the blazing sun. We'll be back.
fancy this? Faucets, so fabulous, they appear to cost a fortune, but don't.
The spectacle of stadium golf. The PGA Tour continues at the Cannon Greater Hartford Open next on CBS Sports.
They had ridden 4.5 hours. They've covered 84 miles. But the cruelest part of this race was still to come. The two highest climbs were just ahead. And the temperature had now reached well into the 90s. Under these conditions, consolation comes from staying within sight of your nearest opponent. Even Delgado, who had appeared untouchable, was now feeling the adverse effects of the heat. The man he feared most was Stephen Rooks, wearing the polka dot jersey. But even the strongest climbers in the world were now on the edge.
The top of the Col du Tourmalet lies on a ridge at almost 7,000 feet. It's the high spot of the Tour de France this year. And one man is drawn towards its summit, Lordolino Cubino. A Spaniard in his first tour makes the first moves for victory. All the way up the climb, Cubino, our leader for 16 days in this year's Tour of Spain, was back into his attacking style. And for a while at least, the field behind could only follow. Delgado knows that Cubino can't win the Tour for the moment. He's content to follow. And while Hampsten struggles, his teammate Raul Alcala seems content. Tourmalet has discovered at last a new champion of its slopes. And below, Cubino blazes a lone trail towards the summit. Basque flag waves proudly. It's a long time since the Spanish riders have had such a good Tour de France, and the natural barriers of the Pyrenees haven't stopped the Spaniards crossing in their thousands to cheer Cubino up the steep mountain. Behind, Gert Ternies on the left and Lucio Herrera maintain the chase. There's still hope yet with the finish climb to come. Stephen Rooks here, Delgado on the far side in yellow, and at the back, Andy Hampsten. The race has still to make its final selection. But for Cubino, the climb at least was his. While behind, a select band of riders are led by Rooks, but not for long as Pedro Delgado moves to the front. A reminder that he is the man in charge of this year's Tour de France. And with an acceleration that belies the slopes of the mountain, Delgado makes his point again. Stephen Rooks is third, and only a handful of men are together for their final destiny today, Luz Ardiden. And so on the dangerous descent, Delgado is in no hurry. Too many riders have crashed badly during the 38 times the mountain has been crossed since 1927. So he's made his point. Now he rides sensibly on, allowing the others to rejoin him for the last mountain.
28 minutes back, Jens Vegerby was struggling at the bottom of the mountain the leaders had already climbed, the Tourmalet. Although the this 25-year-old Dane had spent a career as a domestique, a mere water carrier for the stars. He was now showing as much courage as anyone who has ever ridden a bike. For as long as this race has been held, the French have helped stragglers. They simply don't allow a rider to quit, as long as he has the strength and will to push the pedals. Bleeding badly from the hip and feeling the effects of dehydration, Vegerby continued to fight the hill. Miles ahead, the leaders sped on along the perilous descent and breakneck speeds. For them, it's still a race against time. For Jens Vegerby, now 28 minutes back and losing time, it would take a supreme effort and a lot of help just to finish. Still ahead, the most demanding mountain of them all, Les Ardennes.
Mountainous day of the Tour de France, the men who really matter are still together. Stephen Ruck's time for a friendly word to race leader Pedro Delgado, and the American Andy Hampsten also still with them. This last day in the Pyrenees from Saint-Giron is a row of shark's teeth. Already completed 111 miles of cruel day. But there the finish at Les Ardennes is still to come. The race has covered 1,438 miles and 32 have abandoned before the hardest day in the Pyrenees. Earlier on this day of decision, Jean-Francois Bernard had given up at Luchon. Now, with only Les Ardennes to come, Charlie Motte, the third French favourite, has decided to abandon. The saddest thing to happen in the Tour de France is when your number is removed. The campaign is over. The Tour is over. But when you are half an hour behind, you have little choice. Charlie Motte wore the yellow jersey of leader twice last year. But the race is no respecter of reputation. You're only as good as now. The Tour de France has found new conquerors, and the small group that assembled at the base of Les Ardennes included all of the riders who have shaped the race this year, most notably the man who has controlled it, Pedro Delgado of Spain. He had little to fear from Lordolino Cubino, who is now over 7 minutes ahead on this day. Was a surprise leader of the Tour of Spain, and he eventually finished 4th overall. Now he was surprising again. Started the day 23 minutes behind Delgado. He was no threat. And neither anymore was Andy Hampsten. He could not win this Tour now. Lucio Herrera, the select group slowly reduced the lead of Cubino, but not fast enough to deny him his first ever victory in a stage of the Tour de France. Behind him, Cubino was being chased by the top 7 riders in the race overall. They'd separated themselves from the rest of the Tour de France. Approached the finish, I wonder if he remembered the last Spanish winner here in 1985. It was Pedro Delgado, the overall leader of the race today. In 3 years' time, will it be Lordolino Cubino? Suffered terribly on this last climb, and he had lost over 12 minutes. The Tour was again, for him, a dream. Not so no for Pedro Delgado, who bided his time while another Spanish rider had stolen the show. Now it was his turn, as again he turned on the power from the legs of the world's greatest climber. He left the best of the rest behind, as if they were standing still. To the end, Andy Hampsten has never enjoyed the climb of Les Ardennes. They said this Tour de France, being so short, would also be too easy. They were wrong.
Pedro Delgado had once again dominated the favorites and continued his assault on this year's Tour de France. With his performance on this day, he had added almost another minute to his lead, an emphasis to what many had believed before this stage even began, that only disaster could now keep him from victory in Paris. His lead, Laudolino Cobino, had moved into 12th place and announced he was the star of the future, while Andy Hampsten lost another 7.5 minutes and continued to struggle. Pedro Delgado had dedicated his performance in this Tour de France to his mother, who died in 1986. He was now all but assured of keeping the yellow jersey the remaining 6 days of this race. On the podium, there was a sense of finality. For a man who professes this sport to be a mind game, Andy Hampsten had finally convinced himself that he was beaten. Likewise, teammate Raul Alcala had left his own dreams shattered on the roadside.
No reason why. Sometimes I have it, sometimes I don't. Now it's 2 years in a row I don't have it in the Tour.
In Segovia, Spain, Pedro Delgado is a hero. But back in France, there was a problem. Drug testing had cast a shadow over the yellow jersey. And we'll be back after this word from your local station. Tuesday, day 16. The day after Pedro Delgado virtually assured himself victory at the top of Les Ardennes. Among the riders, there was a feeling of resignation and perhaps relief because the hardest riding was over. It was expected to be a day of routine events. The first day of totally flat racing in over a week, and it was welcomed by the riders. For Delgado, his responsibility now was simply to stay out of trouble until Paris. The finish, too, was strictly routine. Pedro Delgado put on the yellow jersey for the 4th straight day, a habit he would be repeating until Paris a week later. But hours later, the incomprehensible happened. A story was reported on French television, a rumor really. Delgado had tested positive in a standard drug test. Immediately, the tour was turned upside down. The substance had not been identified, and the report was not yet official, but the press was swarming around the Spaniard trying to find the facts. A glance at the evening news made the magnitude of this story obvious. The tour took second billing only to the news that a war was ending in the Middle East. The The news of Pedro Delgado saturated the airwaves. His story was everywhere, and his response was emphatic. There were rumors he quit, but the next morning at the sign-in, Delgado appeared in yellow as usual. With speculation running rampant, there was still no official word from the tour organization. The race had become a media circus, and for the first time, there was reaction voiced by the cycling community.
Just disappointed. I mean, I really respect the man. I think he deserves to win this race, and he has the talent. He's an incredible athlete and a very good man, but it's just unfortunate. It's really sad for Pedro because I'm sure he could win the Tour without, as much as taking an aspirin. He's definitely has the ability to win, and it's really sad if he loses this Tour because his doctor, didn't pay attention to the medication that he was receiving.
Amazingly, even after the day's race had begun, Delgado had not received any notification of which drug he had tested positive for. Cycling Union's drug policy is one of the strictest in sports. Its list of illegal substances is 4 pages long. Its testing procedures are equally as rigid. Every day, the man wearing the yellow jersey, the winner of the day's stage, and 2 riders selected at random must submit to urine tests for drugs minutes after they finish. The samples are then taken by courier to Paris for testing at an independent laboratory. This sheet of paper reported that Delgado had tested positive 3 days earlier, but conspicuously absent was the name of the drug he tested positive for. This is standard procedure, but a rider can find out his infraction by appeal. Another 24 to 48 hours of agonizing uncertainty for Delgado. The shockwaves and disbelief spread quickly around the world and may have hit hardest in his hometown of Segovia, Spain. This town, some 50 miles north of Madrid, has become a hotbed of cycling in a nation rapidly becoming a stronghold in the sport. Pedro Delgado is idolized and imitated in his hometown, and the news of Delgado was the topic of conversation everywhere, by everyone. Here it was not merely sports news. It was a topic of national importance. From early in the morning, reports ran non-stop from France. Wherever people could gather in this small town to get the news, there was a crowd. And when you couldn't be with a crowd, you made sure you were informed. In the local radio station, all news was suspended, waiting official word of Pedro's results.
Vale, ¿tienes eso?
Eso está preparado.
Vale. Sí, pero
Less than 24 hours after the rumor was reported, there was still uncertainty as to the validity of the report.
Buenas tardes, amigos oyentes. Sin duda, la noticia y
At 1:30 Wednesday afternoon, they received word that the drug report was true. And like a nation in mourning, they waited and lingered on every detail of the developments. But still, there was no word on the specific nature of the substance tested. At the end of the day's stage, everyone waited anxiously to see if Pedro had quit the race. He'd appear in yellow another day. Delgado demanded the appeal and reiterated that he would still ride to Paris unless he was proven guilty. The results from the counter test could take another 48 hours, and it was obvious that withstanding the scrutiny could be Delgado's biggest challenge of the entire tour. Could a man who's withstood the physical test of the Tour de France now withstand the relentless badgering of the press? We'll be back.
Of the Tour de France, but it's day 3 of the doping scandal which now surrounds Pedro Delgado. Even at breakfast, the world's press surround him. The yellow jersey no longer the attraction, just whether he's taken dope or not in this year's Tour de France. Delgado remains amazingly calm, confident in the upcoming second analysis perhaps, when the truth will be known.
Oui, bien sûr, il prend le départ et jusqu'à Paris, je pense.
Delgado hopes to wear the yellow jersey until Paris. On Thursday morning, he could find no refuge.
Pedro, muchas gracias y muchas suerte.
Tous les journalistes des différentes télévisions, celui qui a dominé le tour.
Delgado came to the start, he had to face his accusers. He started for the Puy de Dôme under a cloud. Pedro Delgado is in yellow for the second time in his career, but unlike last year, this time he has a real chance of victory in the Tour. In Segovia, where he grew up, he bought his first bike with the money saved by selling newspapers. He's developed into a champion cyclist. Delgado first came to the Tour in 1983, and in the Pyrenees, he proved his speciality was climbing. In 1985, Delgado was on Les Ardennes, where he won his first stage. In 1986, the year that American Greg LeMond challenged Bernard Hinault and won the Tour, Delgado was lying 5th overall when the news of the death of his mother left him too sad to carry on up the climb of Alpe d'Huez. On that day, Delgado vowed he would return to the slopes of the mountain and remember his mother in a very special way. Driven on by her memory, he was untouchable on Alpe d'Huez in 1987 as he raced towards the leader's yellow jersey. It was with mixed feelings that Delgado had taken the overall lead. A year to the day, he retired in tears. So to this year, while the race went on, the organisers spent more time on the phone discussing the affair. At the top of the Puy de Dôme mountain, Delgado finishes 3rd, proving again his dominance of this race. The press were waiting too for Delgado, and his reaction was perhaps predictable. Finally, he lost his composure. Pedro Delgado's second test had been analysed during the stage, and he was negative under the rules of world cycling. But the product, probenecide, was banned on the International Olympic Committee's list. Had he ridden in the Olympic Games, he would have been disqualified. But the laboratory in Paris had made the mistake of reading from the wrong list.
I say it was a fault to say the first time is positive and to say after not is positive, but he can beware the yellow jersey. The fault is at the beginning, but it's very bad for cycling and for the Tour de France and for Pedro Delgado.
So Delgado is free to continue the Tour de France, and Paris awaits.
I spend 3...
Welcome back to the Tour de France. On the Tour, everybody enjoys breakfast. It's the best time of the day, and it's not always tea either. For me, every morning in the Tour de France is the same. A cup of tea, some croissant, and a drink of orange juice. I don't want any more. But the riders, of course, eat this for pleasure. Then they move into the big-time eating, and this is what they'll have for breakfast. An omelette, some yogurt, perhaps some fromage blanc, which is a French type of yogurt, plenty of bread, cornflakes or muesli. All this 3 hours before the race starts. Then it's off down to the start. When they arrive at the start, they'll expect in their team car an isotonic drink, a glucose drink, some concentrated energy drink, and then a selection of food prepared overnight by the team mechanic. Individually sliced pieces of apple, apple tart, energy bars, perhaps a nicety like this roll here with the bread taken out the middle, custard cut inside. Doesn't look very nice, it tastes great. Once the race begins, then they'll wait for the feeding station where they snatch these little bags, and this is what's in the bags. Bananas, energy bars, more slices of apple, more custard tarts, and of course the old concentrated energy drink. During the day too, they'll take on board at least 6 bottles of water, and at the finish, another litre waiting for them to make them okay for the trip to the hotel. At the hotel, the gourmet food is really waiting for them. They'll start off with some fish for the digestion, then they'll move into some white meat, plenty of green beans, which don't ask me why, but they insist on every night, some green salad, some cheese, yogurt, fruit pie, and of course always plenty of fresh fruit. Ending the day with a nice cup of tea to cleanse out the system. And after all that, they'll have consumed 2 gallons of fluid and eaten probably 7,000 calories, and that is only one day in the Tour de France. But if you think the riders have a hard time taking it all in, then the Café de Colombia wagon works equally as hard, pushing it all out. The team serves 5,000 cups of coffee a day, keeping the Tour de France on the road. And even the team's own superstar, Lucho Herrera, enjoys the product of his own country. The other Colombian star is Fabio Parra, who gives an interview for viewers in Bogota, and that brings us to the third element of this united front from Colombia, radio and television, the men who never seem to sleep. Forgiven if you thought the team was commentating on the finish. They're not. Just giving a little atmosphere to the folks back home. There's more.
¿Cuántos están de la meta?
They satellite up to 8 hours a day to Colombia, waking everybody up on the other side of the world with their persuasive tones. And this year has been quite a year for the Colombians. Out of the shadow of the Tour de France come the riders. This year, the Tour's ended its journey through the mountains at record-breaking speed. But in this final week, there are always those adventurers who have made this such a great race over the years. The race has just 392 miles to go to Paris. 39 have given up. Among them, Britain's Robert Miller. To his team car, probably the worst walk you can make as a professional cyclist. Roy Nickman, annoyed with our camera, frustrated with himself, he was eliminated. Privacy when you stop riding the greatest race in the world before the finish line. Remember this man, Valerio Tebaldi? Remember him when he won at Reims? It was the proudest moment of his life. Tebaldi will be one of 47 riders who will not see Paris, at least by bike. But 151 will. We'll be back.
That's it?
An encore performance of the McDonald's American Cup Gymnastics Championships next Saturday.
Ever since I began reporting the Tour de France in 1973, I've seen most things here. I've seen the happiness and sadness of winning and losing the race, the yellow jersey come and go, riders make reputations and riders lose their reputations. But you know, in the month of July, the one person I've never seen is my own wife, Pat. That was until the creation of the Women's Tour de France. Pat was with the British team among the handful of pioneers in 1984 when France, renowned for its chauvinism, shocked the sport by organising the first Tour Féminin. Then only 36 riders started. This year there are 80, including teams from the Soviet Union, America, Australia and China.
You're talking of the women who are really equivalent to amateur men, or even less in fact, because of the lack of racing that they've really had.
But one woman is better than many men. French world champion Jeannie Longo, the winner of the Tour Féminin last year and leader now. Jenny has also been the champion of France for the last 10 years. The other dominant figure in women's world cycling is 39 years old Maria Canins from Italy. She's won the Tour Féminin twice. American Marianne Martin won the first race, but has never returned. Betsy King from New England is the star here. This is not America's best team in Olympic year, but it's the best field in 5 tours.
Everybody is here except the American, because they never want to come here to race the Tour de France. I don't know why.
I think the pressure for the American sponsors is possibly for their girls to stay home. We have Tissot Swiss watches as our sponsor, and they like us to come here.
Women's Tour de France is an amateur race, and our Olympic trials are right after the Tour de France, so all of the best women really have stayed home.
The Tour Féminin is a tour de force for the riders and for the followers. The stages are short, covering usually the end of the men's course, but the journeys by car are long. Whereas the men cover over 2,000 miles in 3 weeks, the women race only a quarter of the distance over 10 days. But to keep up with the men, they drive 1,230 miles. Exhausting to say the least.
Because we are driving a long way, we're always trying to catch up with the men's tour, and the international regulations only allow you to race certain distances, and for women that distance is not very much.
The The great danger of running the two races concurrently is that comparisons are made between the men and the women, and that is unfair. Both races are a long way apart. The women's tour is dominated by these two riders, Maria Canins in the lead and Jenny Longo, but others get a chance in the sprint finishes, just as in the men's race. The traumas of the two tours, however, can be compared, and if nothing else, the women are as tenacious as the men, and they too hate to give up. For the French, this year's race is very successful. Just as well, for the French men aren't doing well in their own event. Jeannie Longo has led since the first day. Only Maria Canins is near enough to stop her second victory in Paris. Some, like the men, won't see Paris, and one thing can be compared with the masculine Tour de France, the pain. At the end of the 11th stage, Jenny Longo is leading Canins by 1 minute and 20. Betsy King is the best American so far, and Linda Brenneman, for a rookie, is learning a lot.
Oh, you think about it, especially in the climbing days. You know, you look up the hill and there's Jeannie Longo up the switchbacks and you're thinking, gosh, you know, I must be a really terrible cyclist. Of course, you're thinking all these terrible things about yourself, but then you have to remind yourself that, you know, your country is sending you here so that you can one day become a Jeannie Longo or become a Maria Canins.
The public is following us, and the public is behind us, and the media stay at the men tour. It's a pity.
Every tour in Paris, after the tour, we have written a letter to the Tour de France and said we wanted it longer, harder, and everything, and every single woman has signed it.
The women's race also finishes in Paris. We'll be back after this word from your local station.
Hi, friends.
Monday. Earlier this morning, at the start line of the final stage of the Tour de France from Namur to Paris, Pedro Delgado was still the focus of attention. But this time, he was the man in yellow, the man who was hoping now to win the Tour de France. Of the last day of the Tour de France are not like the other 20. Now, two rivals for nearly 3 weeks are friends. On the right, Stephen Rooks alongside Pedro Delgado. And this time for amusement, the tallest man in the race, Milan Jerko, on the smallest rider's bike. Guess where the smallest rider is? Vincenzi Felda. Paris, no one was in a hurry to reach the Champs-Élysées. Raul Alcala riding at the front here with Pedro Delgado. At one time, they were rivals in the mountains. In the end, for Lucio Herrera, this has not been a tour of advancement. He was more successful last year. But it certainly has for Canada's Steve Bauer. Winner of the first stage, he also wore the leader's yellow jersey, one of only 6 riders in the Tour. Pedro Delgado has been the master of the Tour de France. He'll win it now if he doesn't fall off.
The men's race was not the only one in Paris today. The women came riding down the Champs-Élysées just hours before the men. The trip ended their 521-mile journey after 13 days on the roads of France, and Jeannie Longo was wearing the yellow jersey. Riding next to Longo was her strongest rival, Maria Canins of Italy, in the polka dot jersey. But the story of this race has to be Longo, who's worn that jersey since day one of this race. The top American women did not ride here in France, opting instead to stay at home to prepare for the Olympic trials. And if you're looking for similarities between men and women cycling, they're massive pileup. Regrouped. It was a full sprint down the Champs-Élysées. In the back, another crash. But at the finish, it would be Virginie Lafargue who crossed the line in the most prestigious stage of this race. But the 1988 women's champion is Jeannie Longo. The highest American finisher, Betsy King of Connecticut. And the rest of the American finishers. The story of this race and perhaps this sport is Jeannie Longo, who wins for the second year in a row the Tour de France. The men are coming to Paris. Stay with us.
And so Pedro Delgado is now heading towards Paris in yellow, smiling at last. All the survivors in the Tour de France were on the final road home. But there was still time for one final attack by the man who's second overall, Stephen Rooks. Of the Eiffel Tower, Stephen Rooks led away 7 other riders, including Raul Alcala from Mexico. This was the final attack of the Tour, a final show of defiance by the men who have attacked one another for 3 weeks. The Place de la Concorde, the 8 breakaways headed for the finishing circuit up and down the Champs-Élysées. They had a lead of 30 seconds. In the main field, Pedro Delgado, safe in the knowledge his own teammates now were leading the chase at the head of the pack. Last year it was Jeff Pierce from the 7-Eleven team who won on the Champs-Élysées. Now could it be Raul Alcala? Had to be taken seriously, but this year it was going around the circuit the other way round for the first time since the race first came on the Champs-Élysées in 1975. It meant also that there was a long downhill stretch and the field were out for the kill. Breakaway now was trying to get things together again because they weren't working properly together. They were thinking of the win while Rooks was thinking of the escape. Alcala here more concerned with the win. riders face their 6 final laps up and down the Champs-Élysées, each lap being a little short of 4 miles. That's all that remains now of the Tour de France and all that remains of the race today for Pedro Delgado. Once onto the Champs-Élysées, Raul Alcala was having to work harder than most to keep the breakaway in the lead. Delgado's team behind, with the men doing the driving. The riders turned in the shadow of the Arc de Triomphe, heading down towards the finish at the end of the second circuit of the Champs-Élysées. The whole field were closing in. Even Pedro Delgado himself took up the chase along with his team. He knew now his lead was safe. This was a chance to show off the real colour of the man who's led this tour since July the 14th. Corner under the Arc de Triomphe for the last time. The Tour de France came in for a mass sprint finish with Malcolm Elliott leading out on the right, but in the centre of the picture, the man in green, the fastest sprinter in the world, John Paul Van Poppel, wins his 4th stage of the Tour de France this year. For the man in yellow, Pedro Delgado, all the traumas behind him, he really is now the winner of the 1988 Tour de France. The result, Pedro Delgado, 84 hours, 27 minutes, 53 seconds. And from 7th to 12th, the time gaps are massive. And here are the rest of the American 7-Eleven finishers. So Federico Baramontes, Luis Ocaña, and now the 3rd Spanish winner, Pedro Delgado of Spain. And here's Tim Brandt now with a couple of the American stars.
We've been joined at the finish line by Andy Hampsten and Davis Phinney. Davis, first of all, 3 times you've tried to get to Paris and you finally made it.
I finally got here. I'm here. I'm happy. I'm tired, but I am really happy.
What was it like as you came down to Champs-Élysées?
Well, you know, I was really intent on getting here, but it was so nerve-wracking just because the race was very fast and I wanted to do well today. I really wanted to win. And so I really didn't think about it. Oh boy, I'm done. Everything's great. I just thought I got to get to that finish line first. Didn't really work out, but now that I'm done, I feel pretty good.
Andy, how about you? All the success after the Giro, and you come here with all the high expectations. Is there disappointment?
Well, I've been dealing with a bit of disappointment during these 3 weeks. Unfortunately, I'm used to it after last year. Last year, my health really failed me. This year, I started the tour with a bit of a cold, which wasn't really hurting me. It didn't hurt my legs at all, but it prevented me from really giving 100%, and I'm no good at racing anything other than 100%. So coming into Paris, it's partially relief that it's over, but even before this race is over, I'm already planning on next year and, you know, the details that I have to change over the next year.
What will you change? And how about the preparation coming into this race after the Giro? Everybody said, oh, look, he went home to Boulder.
Well, I think my racing program this year, designed by Mike Neal and the rest of the team, was ideal. We looked at the race schedule last fall and then this winter decide what we were going to do. I feel that doing the Tour of Italy was the best preparation. While we were planning the schedule, it was planned that everyone would go home afterwards, so mentally I really had to go home. I had to go home and recover from the Giro mentally, but physically it was too hard for me. The 2 trips across the Atlantic, really, I needed to recover physically 100%. And it was too much traveling, so that was a mistake. At the time, it wasn't, because it was necessary. I had to get home, but for next year, I know that I'll plan to stay in Europe. I'll probably hide out in Switzerland or somewhere for 3 weeks and bring my own Mexican food over.
Davis, how about you? I want to talk about your plans for next year.
Big deal.
But what about being out there? Is there any way to tell these people what it's like riding the Tour de France?
No.
How about your future?
No, I feel really good because it has taken me a long time to get to this point and to be able to finish this race. But more than that, it's just been a tremendous learning experience, and I've learned a lot about myself and a lot about what I thought were my limitations and that I could go beyond. And I feel really good about my racing and racing in Europe, and I feel really good about this team. I mean, Team 711, these guys are something special, and they have a lot of character, and I'm so proud of everybody on this team that, I want to stick with it, and I want to stay with these guys, and, we're going to win this race. There's no question. I mean, this guy's going to win the race, and we're going to do it right.
Davis, congratulations. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Andy?
All right.
Congratulations. Good luck to you, too.
Thanks a lot.
And so the 1988 Tour de France has added yet another colorful page to the history books of this great race. Since 1903, this spectacle, presented so proudly by the French, has captured the imagination of a people. And since 1983, it certainly has captured ours at CBS. For the past 6 years, our team has been very proud to bring you the greatest bicycle race in the world. For those of you who have been with us the entire journey, and for those who may have joined us along the way, we say thanks and hope that you enjoyed our coverage as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. So for Phil Liggett and all of us here at CBS Sports, I'm Tim Brandt saying so long from Paris.
CBS Sports Sunday has been sponsored by Bud Light. Everything else is just a light. Thompson's Water Seal Exterior Stain. Beauty that lasts at last.